Washington has a spending problem, and the American people know it. But instead of eliminating Biden's Green New Scam, some Republicans want to raise taxes. Increasing taxes on Main Street and hardworking families is a gut punch. Voters didn't send Republicans to Washington to raise taxes. They sent them to cut spending and protect their paychecks. Congress has a choice. Cut Biden's wasteful spending or raise taxes. Tell the politicians we need tax relief, not tax hikes. Learn more at protectprosperity.com. Paid for by Americans for Prosperity.
Every day, thousands of Comcast engineers and technologists, like Kunle, put people at the heart of everything they create.
In the average household, there are dozens of connected devices. Here in the Comcast family, we're building an integrated in-home Wi-Fi solution for millions of families like my own. It brings people together in meaningful ways.
Kunle and his team are building a Wi-Fi experience that connects 1 billion devices every year. Learn more about how Comcast is redefining the future of connectivity at comcastcorporation.com/Wi-Fi.
Hello, everyone. I'm Therese Bottomly, editor of the Oregonian and Oregon Live. This is Beat Check with the Oregonian. Today, I'm talking to Watchdog reporter Ted Sickinger about his recent investigation into commercial licensing for truckers. Ted, welcome back to Beat Check.
Thanks, Therese. Good to be here and talk journalism.
So let's briefly just make sure listeners understand the background of this story, which ran a few weeks ago and just had an update recently. A few weeks ago, we published an article that you wrote about Skyline CDL School. Why don't you remind listeners the basics of what you found in your investigation?
Yeah, so this story was about a commercial driver's school with branches in Washington and Oregon, again, called Skyline CDL, that was allegedly bribing one of the state of Washington's contract testers to obtain commercial driver's licenses for unqualified drivers. Washington, like Oregon does, outsources driver's license testing to independent contractors. And the managers of this school were allegedly mailing this particular tester, a guy named Jason Hodson, wads of cash to pass these unqualified students. And when I say unqualified, we're talking about drivers who may never have had to take a test at all. And drivers from a school that regulators had previously audited and found was relying on unqualified instructors, falsifying records, bypassing mandated English proficiency standards for drivers, and failing all kinds of documentation requirements that they have for these schools. So, as a listener, think about that the next time you're driving down I-5 and see a truck pass you at 80 miles an hour. Trucking is one of the most hazardous professions in the country, according to BLS statistics. Last year, trucks were involved in accidents that killed about 5,500 people and injured another 150,000. And advocates say that the fraudulent CDL schools are not uncommon across the country, and they rarely face any meaningful consequences.
So CDL refers to commercial driver license, and that doesn't allow somebody, like if it's hazmat or something, or gasoline or diesel. I mean, does that license allow people to drive any kind of big truck, or is it just certain types of trucks?
Well, so in general, there are two classes of commercial licenses. Class A is a license to drive a tractor trailer, semi-truck, while Class B is for single vehicles like buses and smaller trucks. And some of the things that you're mentioning involve specific endorsements on top of that as well. But in this case,
so this is the basic license that lets somebody get a job driving a truck with freight.
Driving a semi, a Class A
semi.
license. Yeah.
Okay.
And we're talking about a school that was advertising its branches in Vancouver and Auburn and in Hillsborough as one of the low cost options in the metro area. $3,500 to $4,000 for a month long course in preparation for a commercial test.
And so then people are being sent hours and hours out of their way to go to this one particular person, and then once they had that license, I mean, Oregon doesn't retest people who got their license in Oregon, right? Do they just accept that license?
Right, who got their license in Washington. So in this case, what we also found was that there were actually a total of 13 drivers that had passed with this tester without taking a test, I believe, who subsequently relicensed in another state. And 6 of them were in Oregon. All of them were Skyline students. And I think you need to transfer your license, in this case, from Washington to Oregon. You need an updated medical certificate, I believe, but they don't actually retest CDL holders when they transfer their license from another state. The DMV told me that, they rely on the fact that other states' licensing process work in accordance with federal rules.
And in this case, they had the Washington Department of Licensing, actually, they were doing stakeouts.
Yeah, they were. I mean, they had gotten a complaint back in 2003 that this particular tester was passing unqualified drivers. They did an audit initially that didn't find any problems, and they went back repeatedly, but then they kind of kept hearing about this, and they started, just in their regular audits, they'd go up there and half the students wouldn't show up, and they found that suspicious. So they did a series of stakeouts in early 2024, just parked outside this guy's facility, and he'd drive through the gates in the truck in the morning at 6:30 a.m., and nothing would happen all day. And lo and behold, he'd enter 6 tests into the system for students that tested that day. Not all of them passing grades. They found that he was also manipulating pass-fail rates so that he would not sort of stick out for just, a blanket pass for everybody. But they did that a number of times. And then they ended up with other sort of sources of information in their investigation as well.
And the bundles of cash, I mean, that was pretty unusual. You said they found, somewhere above $500 in cash and paper clipped and envelopes. What was going on there?
Yeah. So there was this manager and owner, part owner, at least in Oregon, Vitaly Veliky, who was sending these gold envelopes stuffed with individual wads of cash. And each one of those bundles of bills was about $525. And paperclip to each bundle was a sticky note with the driver in question's date of birth. The Department of Licensing released pictures of both of those in response to our public records requests. And they had a witness who told them that each bundle was for a driver that would not actually be present for their test. And there was apparently so much cash showing up that this guy, Jason Hodson, the banks were limiting his deposits.
Wow. So the Washington Department of Licensing kind of went back after they identified this problem, and they identified 877 drivers that purportedly were tested, 822 of them from Skyline between April 2023 and September 15th, 2024. Now, they retested 74 of those drivers, and 80% failed the exam, and the state canceled 102 credentials for Skyline students. So if you do the math there, clearly there's several hundred drivers still on the road who may also not pass the test should they be retested. I mean, is there any sense they're going to go more deeply into that?
No, not at present. And I think unless federal regulators get more involved in this. Again, the DOL, the Washington Department of Licensing, told me they did their best to identify when this scheme began and to devise a retest methodology to capture the students most likely involved. But they didn't have the cooperation of the parties involved here. And regulators have admitted to me they just don't really know whether they've captured all the students involved. Their original test plan only called for retesting about 16% of those 877 drivers that you mentioned. And the sample was that small because they said it would have been colossally expensive and time consuming to retest everybody. And this, major headache for drivers who are out on the road regularly. And in the end, they only ended up testing 74 drivers, and that's about 8% of that larger pool.
Yeah, it's
And again,
nothing.
as you said, 80% of them failed.
Yeah, that's scary. I mean, like you said, we all drive on I-5, we drive on I-84 next to these big double tractor trailer rigs, and you want to think that they're qualified to drive, and the vast majority of truck drivers are qualified to drive, but this particular school seems to have had a problem. So you mentioned getting the pictures of the cash from public records requests. So talk about your difficulties in getting information about this case and kind of what you had to go through to get records and so forth to substantiate what you were hearing.
Yeah, so this story came in, like many, through a tip, and it certainly sounded immediately intriguing to me. So I jumped on it and started asking questions of the regulators in question at the DOL and the Workforce Board up in Washington. And I was answering these questions, and they were responding to me, but I was getting these kind of piecemeal responses that really didn't give me, a great way to kind of have a coherent narrative about how this went down. So mid-February, I filed a bunch of records requests and to get the full Monty, and those took about 2 months to get. And that was really just a preliminary batch of kind of the final investigation reports. And I'm still receiving material about it today, which is sort of revealing in its own light and adds additional detail. I'm not sure that we'll circle back on this particular story, but it like many times in dealing with public agencies, I find that Washingtons are actually responsive, but they don't have the same deadlines that we do in our public records law. But again, this is sometimes pulling teeth, and this took a while to get, and it's a little frustrating. But they did come through in the end with material that enable us to do this story.
Yeah, and what a fascinating story. And they also, I will put the links to the stories in the episode notes, but there was impact from this story and from these investigations. Where talk about what happened to the Washington Skyline School first, and then we'll circle back to Oregon.
Well, so Washington, actually, they had suspended this tester back in October, well prior to us writing about it, and they suspended the school's license at the end of December, and they officially terminated it in March while we were reporting on this. The state of Oregon, meanwhile, really wasn't very clued into anything. They had heard that one of the testers up in Washington was under investigation, but they knew nothing about Skyline until I started asking them questions. I said, "What are you doing about this? These guys have a branch here too." And the answer at that point was nothing, but they then turned around fairly quickly, went on an inspection. They fined these folks, $500 for, it's kind of a slap on the wrist for failing to report the licensing disciplinary actions up in Washington. And as it turns out, the day we're speaking here, they have the Higher Education Coordinating Committee has suspended the school here in Oregon and prohibited its owners from starting anything similar, and they're citing a variety of Oregon statutes dealing with fraud, misrepresentation, ethics, etc. So they've shut them down here. There are also a variety of trucking safety and accident victims advocates who have requested that the U.S. Department of Transportation's Inspector General institute a formal investigation of this, and if appropriate, refer that to the U.S. Department of Justice for criminal prosecution. And they were largely citing our work as the basis for that.
And we haven't been able to reach one of the former co-owners that you mentioned. And has anybody in charge of either of the Washington and Oregon schools really had anything to say in response to your findings?
Well, we did reach an individual who wouldn't identify themselves at the number registered to Pavel Turpe, also known as Pavlo Turpe, and he is an owner of the school both in Oregon and Washington, and he didn't identify himself as the respondent, but was responding as an owner of the school, and essentially saying he had no recollection of any of this, that DOL, the Department of Licensing, was the person who hired this tester, so if there were problems with the tester, it wasn't their fault, that they were trying to bring things back in line. And again, subsequent to us beginning to go down this avenue, both states have shut the school down.
And what about the tester? Did he have anything to say for himself?
He actually was the one, and I said mistakenly that it was a manager for Skyline, who said he knew nothing about this. First I've heard of it. I guess I'll leave it at no comment. So no, essentially.
And when we visited the address for the Oregon school, it's a little unusual, a little unconventional.
Yeah, sort of super sketchy place out in Hillsboro. It's this old ranch house that is pretty shop worn, and long grass out in front, an abandoned shopping cart. But it's kind of this ranch house that backs up on this big truck lot. It is not in good repair. So it too looked a little sketchy.
And you mentioned the Higher Education Coordinating Commission, HEC, we call it in Oregon. They oversee, we think of them as universities and community colleges, but so their role here, they're not licensing drivers, that's DMV, but their role is overseen because it's a trade school in effect?
Correct. They oversee all private career schools as well.
Okay.
They license them. They are responsible for auditing and making sure that they're meeting, a pretty extensive list of statutes that govern these schools in Oregon.
And, you mentioned the language proficiency. I would think that driving a truck might be a good paying job for somebody, moving to this country and starting fresh. And there was some evidence that Skyline did appeal to some folks who didn't speak English as their first language. But you mentioned there was no admission process to screen for English proficiency. So what kind of concerns would that raise for regulators or for the general public?
So Skyline was actually specifically catering to immigrants. It was advertising, again, that it had these very low tuition rates, flexible schedules, and the classes were taught in English, Russian, Ukrainian, Turkish, and Spanish. And they were heavily catering to Russians and Ukrainians. And federal regulations actually require that commercial drivers demonstrate English proficiency. And that's because they want these folks to be able to communicate with the public and various officials, while out on the road, if that's a cop, if that's a way station, an inspector. They want them to understand highway traffic signals and signs and be able to, again, keep records that are required. And in fact, a few weeks ago, President Trump issued one of his many executive orders, this one dealing with increasing safety in trucking. And he specifically directed the Secretary of Transportation to make sure that these English proficiency requirements are being enforced. And most of the students that Washington investigators ultimately got hold of, I think they ended up interviewing 17 students, and only one could speak English adequately to have their interview without the use of a translator up there. So that it kind of gives you a sense of how strictly these things are being enforced.
Interesting. Well, really interesting investigation. We are recording this May 14th. You will have a story today on the state of Oregon's crackdown. I will put the link to that story and your original story in the episode notes. I hope people take time to read about this very important work. And with that, we'll call it a wrap. Thanks so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, give us a 5-star rating and review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps people find the show. Tell a friend, help spread the word. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this one is with a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time.